web form, and at the bottom of the page it gives you the XML, which is nice. It's not going to automatically do fancy formatting for you like your lists. You would actually have to put in the XML to make a list be nicely formatted, but it will do all the header for you and author elements and the overall structure. So it's making a functional XML document for you. Links to RFC lets you use links to create an XML file. Pandoc to RFC lets you use wiki style markdown to create an XML file. I had mentioned those at the beginning, and we'll have more detail on links to RFC. I do want to mention about Pandoc to RFC that there is so with inrof edit we saw the option to convert text to inrof, which is kind of the reverse, right? That can be helpful if you're starting with no source file but only an internet draft. There is RFC to Pandoc, so going from text to the wiki style markdown, and I have the URL for that if you're interested, from the creator of Pandoc to RFC, and that's under development so that you could go the other direction. So a few basics about XML. I'm guessing most people are somewhat familiar, but occasionally this is the reason people are not using XML to RFC, is that they don't really know exactly what's involved. So there are outer tags and inner tags to nest your elements. You can have attributes. So for example, the author element in that example has attributes initials and surname. It is case sensitive. You want to use an entity that starts with an ampersand, that ampersand LT semicolon for the less than sign, and for ampersand so that it knows not to think that it's XML. And there are XML basics inside of some of the documentation at that URL. You can have an empty tag, like the organization example above. So the overall document structure, like the whole XML file, is the whole RFC. So you open tag RFC, close tag RFC at the bottom, and there are 3 sections, front, middle, and back. So it would have an open front, and then it contains the author elements, abstract, close front, and then you'd open the middle, have the sections. T tag is like the equivalent of P in HTML, so it's for paragraphs and lists and figures. Close middle, open back, and that's where you'd have the references. Close the back, close the RFC. The DTD, if you already look at DTDs, might explain the details more to you, but as I mentioned, starting with a template also puts you on the right track for this. So you want to make an author element for yourself. This is basically where you put the information that would appear at the bottom of an internet draft, like your address. It'll also extract your first initial and last name to put at the top header of the document. T tags around paragraphs, figure artwork around figures. So those tags usually appear together, the element, figure, and artwork. It's basically the same as the .nf that I mentioned with inrof edit. .nf is telling it, don't wrap these lines. In XML to RFC, figure artwork is telling the tool, don't wrap these lines, output exactly as I have it in the source file. You enter references, so actually this should say citations, so like every time you want the square brackets to appear, so square brackets RFC 2119, you would do xref target equals quotation marks RFC 2119, and that / means that I made an empty xref element, but you can also make it contain text if you want, which would only have an effect in the HTML file, not in your plain text output. And using citation libraries for references allows you to as I mentioned, easily create a reference without having to type in the author names and the title of the RFC and the date. It automatically is going to pull that from existing citation libraries. And I'm going to go into more detail on that. So one attribute for the RFC is the IPR attribute. This determines the copyright notice that appears on your internet draft. The trustee.itf.org website is the place to go for more information about copyright. So this is what the opening element would look like for an informational document. RFC category equals info. Doc name equals draft-example.00, like your actual draft string. And IPR equals trust 2009-02. That's the most typically used one, but there are other options. And if you're wondering about this, I recommend going to the IETF Trust Copyright FAQ, which is at that URL. The one that is also starred, used to add the 6C3 paragraph, has to do with if you're using RFCs, relying on RFCs that were published, older RFCs, then you might want to look into this 6C3 paragraph. Again, the place to go is the ITF Trust Copyright FAQ. I mentioned making your own author block. This is what an empty author block looks like. Initials and surname, full name, role. The role attribute lets you designate someone as editor, and the way that that's going to show up is ED after their name on the first page and editor in parentheses in the author's address information. Some people don't know about the role attributes, so they hack it and try to add it into the surname attribute, but there is actually a way to do it within the document structure. Organization is your company or affiliation. Postal address is self-explanatory. It's not required for an internet draft or an RFC that you fill out all of this information, but the most essential piece of information is your email address, because that's how people are going to contact you about the content that's in your internet draft. So if you have a long-lived email address, for example, an email address that's not just your employer provided email address, it might be a good idea to use that on internet drafts, so that in 5 years, if someone wants to contact you about what you wrote in an internet draft, or perhaps an RFC, then they can still get a hold of you if you're no longer at the, if you provide a long-lived email address. Okay, lists are one of the elements in XML files that authors often use. If you've read an internet draft, you've probably seen a little bulleted list, if not something fancier. In XML to RFC, there's a list element and you set the style attribute. So empty would just indent items, and numbers dynamically numbers each of the items which appear inside of a T tag within the list. Letters, symbols, and you can actually control what symbols you want to have with your bulleted list. That one that starts with question mark RFC is a processing instruction, which I'll talk a little bit more about. Text list symbols, so you're just telling it, I want these symbols to be used for lists, for bulleted lists specifically, which is style equals symbols. And as you go in certain levels, like if you have nested lists, then it would move through those text list symbols. Hanging, this is a common one that gets used in internet drafts where you have a term and then you want to start the text underneath it, or you want to start the text next to it, but when the text wraps you want it to be indented underneath the term. That's style equals hanging. right now there's not an awesome way to do, not an easy way to do the first one I said, the term and then a line break and then text underneath it, which looks nice in the text output, but is not as easy to create in the XML file. You would use style equals hanging, and then you would use a command called vspace in order to get a line break. And the last one on there is for customized lists, and I go into more detail on that one. So let's say you want to say rec1, rec2, rec3, you can just have it do that and it'll dynamically number them. It's that format rec %D is telling it digit. That's the placeholder for digit, and it'll automatically do the right thing. Similarly, if you want other types of lists. What's CData? A CData block is left alone by XML to RFC. It does not try to parse the XML inside of a CData block. For example, if a figure contains a less than sign, you don't have to use the entity LT. It is useful for including XML examples in the document. Typo on this one, such as, not such tasks. So this is really useful if you're having an XML file that contains examples of XML. You need to use CData. Make your life easier. And some people in their XML files just put CData automatically for every single figure artwork, because then they don't have to think about it like, oh, are there any characters in here that I need to replace with entities? They just use CData all the time, which is fine, in my opinion. Okay, more about citing references. So this is, this topic is kind of involved for XML to RFC because there are, partly because there are more extensive citation libraries, as I mentioned at the beginning. Also because there are different ways to accomplish the same output. And different people have opinions about what's the best way, but as long as if your primary goal is to get an internet draft that you can post using the ID submission tool, it doesn't really matter which one of these ways you use. But this is just for citing in text to get the square brackets to show up. You do the xref element. So xref target equals, and the text that's there will show up assuming that you have simrefs equals yes, which is something I'll talk about more. You can also get it to do like 1, 2, 3 numbered references throughout your document, like simply numbered references, in which case the target would still be the same as that, like RFC 2119, because that's how it knows which reference to pull. But in the text output, instead of RFC 2119, it would just be 1, or whatever number reference it was in your document. As an editor, I find that it's nicer to have the representational ones, they call them symbolic, but the ones that's actually the name of the document. But it's not a requirement. If you're using XML to RFC, the beauty of it is that it will automatically renumber them. So let's say you decided you were going to do 1, 2, 3 instead of these representational ones, and then you edited the document, you wanted to cut 10 references out. So if you are hand editing the text file, this would be a very painful process because you would have to go through the document and renumber any of the references that came after it, right? Like you would renumber them in the references section, and then you'd go through the whole document and renumber them to match up. But the beauty of using XML to RFC, because it's using that target, it's automatically going to update the numbers. That's the same goes for the list elements that I mentioned earlier, right? Like let's say you have a list and you use style equals numbers, and you had 45 elements on inside the list, 45 items. And you cut out a few of them throughout. There's no manual update to go through and renumber those. It's going to dynamically renumber your output, which is nice. Okay, about the citation libraries. So this is a screenshot from xml.resource.org. There are citation libraries specifically for RFCs, internet drafts, W3C documents, Jabber, 3GPP, and miscellaneous contains a variety, like ITU and IEEE documents, among others. The ones that are up to date are the RFCs and the Internet Drafts citation libraries. The rest of them are less up to date. So if, let's say you're going to reference a W3C document in your Internet Draft, it's to your advantage to look at the citation library and say, oh, is it here? And say, oh, no, it's not here, probably if it's a W3C document that's recent. But you could use an existing one as a template if you wanted to, like copy and paste the reference element and then change it to be your document, your W3C document that you wanted to reference. So these do exist. I recommend using them. And here's more about how to use them. So as I mentioned, there are multiple ways to get the same effect. So the short way, the long way, the really long way, they all yield the same text output, which is what's shown at the bottom, basically a reference, as you would normally see it at the end of an Internet Draft. So I'm going to walk through the short way, the long way, and the really long way. But in short, the difference is the short way is a processing instruction. That's what PI stands for. Processing instruction in the references section where you're telling it, include this file. And then you would refer to it in the body of the document this way, with the xref. So to get things to match up, you have an xref in the body of the document and a reference element in the end of the document. The long way is you define an entity at the top, which is basically one line, so it's not super long, and then you use the entity, invoke the entity in the references section. So that start with an ampersand and be whatever you named it. In this case, you might have named it RFC 2119. And the really long way is that you have the whole reference element inside of your document. Okay, so more examples of this. This is the short way of using the processing instructions. So the names of these files that are in the citation library all start with reference dot. And the RFCs are all of this form. So once you learn that one, or you have one inside your document, you can just paste it and change the number and get the ones that you want. The Internet Drafts usually don't include the word draft. See how that one's I-D dot ITF role of 0. That .xml is optional on these. You can also just call it reference.rfc .2119. You don't have to put .xml. And the final one is an example from the miscellaneous citation library for an IEEE document. It's pretty long. So let's say you didn't want to have that full title, or you wanted to do something differently, then you have to use a different method to insert the reference. You have to put in the whole reference element if you want to actually edit its contents. So this is the one where I mentioned you define an entity inside the doc type. It's at the top. And then in the references section, you use the ampersand to get the entity to insert that information. So these are the same 3 documents that were on the previous slide, but here it's providing the full URL. So this is where the file actually lives in the citation library. So you can see the citation libraries live in public, RFC, bib.xml, and then specifically all the Internet Drafts live in bib.xml3, and all of the miscellaneous live in bib.xml2. All the RFCs are in just plain old bib.xml. So the reason I point this out is, let's say you wanted to browse around, like if you want to look at what's inside of miscellaneous, then you can put that in your browser. It's the same as if you just clicked this right here. So those directories are where the .xml files actually live. And there are all these options for you to install them locally, but to have your own, not install them, but for you to have your own copy of the citation library. And there's no real need to do that unless you're wanting to do a lot of things offline, because it'll just pull it from where it lives. And when you're using the short way, these processing instructions just are going to the same location, the xml.resource.org directory. They're not doing anything significantly different from this option. And finally, the long way, you're including the complete reference element. So this is what it actually looks like in the citation library, except I snipped out some parts where it says snip because it was too long. And that information wouldn't end up in your citation anyway. So these reference elements in the citation library sometimes have a lot of things like the abstract, but as you know, in the references section of a document, that abstract's not actually going to appear. Let's say you need to reference a web page or something that it's not in the citation library. Then this is an empty reference template with kind of the bare minimum in it. So if you're referencing an RFC or an internet draft, I do not recommend making it from scratch. I would recommend using the citation libraries for internet drafts and RFCs, but obviously a lot of things you might want to make it from scratch. You do have to include the date element, even if there is no date. You could do an empty date. Series info name equals and value equals is an element that lets you get the text that you want. So for an RFC, it would be name equals RFC, value equals 2119. But let's say you want to do volume 1, issue 3. You can also use series info to get that type of text. So it's the more flexible one. And another thing to point out is the anchor is the one that corresponds to the target of the xref. So that's the name of the reference that is probably going to appear in square brackets if you have simrefs equals yes. Then target is for a URL. So if this is a web page, then you would put the URL in the target, and it would actually show up in the text output inside of less than and greater than. So for example, on this IEEE one, if we looked at the guts of this, like what it actually looked like in the citation library, they used the target attribute to get that URL to show up at the end. The trick with the XML to RFC references is you don't get to choose the order that things appear. You fill this out with as much information, the relevant information, and then it orders the information into the proper form. So it's going to be, so it's always going to put that URL at the end. So one thing I mentioned, how to get numbered refs instead of symbolic, e.g. 1 instead of RFC 2119. You would use the processing instruction RFC simrefs equals no. So simrefs meaning symbolic refs. Yes is the default, but you can turn it off. And these processing instructions typically appear at the top of the document. If you start with a template or use the ID creation wizard, then it's going to automatically put some processing instructions at the top of your internet draft, at the top of the XML file. How to get names instead of RFC numbers, like the example that we looked at earlier with nroff edit, IKV2 instead of the RFC number, you would have to insert the complete reference element and then change the anchor attribute. So reference anchor equals IKV2. And then you would have to update any corresponding xref targets that are in the body of the document. So this is a bit more involved to give it a special label than in nroff. It's a little easier, although you'd still have to update every time you mention it in text. So inserting a table. There is a text table element that contains ttcall elements for the columns and C elements to hold the contents of each cell. This is an example of what it looks like. And so it tries to nicely format using ASCII a table. Another option is to use figure artwork. So the same way you would put in other ASCII art that was not a table, you would just say this is the artwork, paste in your table as you've hand formatted it or made it otherwise, and then close your artwork and close your figure. People often use figure artwork because the text table is a bit involved, as you can see. But again, copy and paste is your friend with XML to RFC. If you have one that works, then you take the one that works and you've changed the data. So these are just subjective, my opinion. It's good to use XREF for references as opposed to hard coding your reference. By hard coding your reference, I mean if you type square brackets into your XML file, then you're not using the XREF reference relationship, which doesn't really affect the text output, but would affect your HTML output if you were interested in making HTML from your XML file. XREF can also be used for section cross references. So for example, if you want to say C section 9, you can say C XREF target equals Ianacons if you named the IANA consideration section Ianacons. Don't hard code a section number to refer within a document. The reason why is obviously if you cut this, move sections around, cut sections, then the number is going to change. You might forget to go change it in the body of your document. But if you've used the XREF, it's nice and happy, it dynamically numbers it, and so it's going to be the correct number, still point to the correct section. And do use list elements for lists. Don't insert a list as a figure. So some people, they're like, oh, here's my list, oh, it doesn't look right, so then they just put figure artwork and artwork figure around the whole list. Not ideal because it's not taking advantage of the fact that XML RFC will wrap the text for you and make the indentation look nice. So that's the primary motivation to use a list element, is that it will look nice. And there is enough functionality, all the various attributes, to get the list to look how you want, numbers or symbols, etc. And put your XML file to work. You can share your comments and your edits with your co-authors. You can upload the XML file to the ID submission tool when you post your draft. Assuming your ID is approved for publication, you can send your XML to the RFC editor when your draft, and we'll already have it if you uploaded it to the submission tool. And you can use the HTML version. Also, there's a style sheet or XSLT for getting a different kind of HTML output. So XML to RFC takes an XML file and will spit out various types of output depending on what you want. In addition, there's within the browser this style sheet that lets you have a different HTML, which I think I'll show you. What is it exactly? It's these transformations that you can get HTML or even PDF, and the documentation's on this website that is created by Julian Reschke. There's no converter step, it just happens in your browser if you have the XSLT. And if you do get to the point where your internet draft is approved, if you used multiple files, some people divide their XML up into multiple files, then consolidate, or they make their own citation library. Consolidate into one file and run the file with XML to RFC as it's available in the online converter. Make sure it makes a text file. If you're using processing instructions that are local or specific to alternate XML converters, for example, you've made your own development, or you're using the style sheet, not really the style sheet, the XSLT, then you need to understand that XML to RFC is not going to know about those. So common questions that come up with, one common question that comes up with XML to RFC is, how do I control the white space? Like, how do I get blank lines between list items? So there are processing instructions called compact and subcompact. We recommend compact equals yes and subcompact equals no. Compact is at the level of the sections, so it means that you will not start each main section on a new page. Compact equals no, will put one blank line between list items. And this should minimize the need for vspace, which is the command that I mentioned earlier that you can use to force a line break or force a certain amount of blank lines. So these are processing instructions that you would put at the top of your document. And if you start with a template, they will already be in there. So XML to RFC has a lot more functionality. For version 2, it's at that URL for documentation and the descriptions of the elements and attributes. Even though that documentation was with V1, it still applies for V2. If you download and install V2 GUI, it also has documentation built into it. The full list of processing instructions is in the README. XML to RFC FAQ has a lot of what we've covered today and more questions. And again, the mailing list is a good place to go with questions. Okay, so now I'm going to demo. So this is what the main page looks like. It says data on here. This is V2 that's on the main page. And this is the warning telling you, you know, hey, this is using V2. It's much stricter. If you find errors, put them in the issue tracker, as I mentioned. Let's say this is making you unhappy. You can go to the old one and use V1. Here's where you would choose your file. And let's do plain text output. And let's just have it in the window. Yay. So it made an internet draft from the XML file. What did that XML file look like that I just had? Sorry, I'm having some screen sizing issues on my end. I can't see things because they're gigantic. So this was the XML file that just created this internet draft in the browser. As you can see, it starts with an XML declaration, and then they used the long way, quote unquote. They defined these entities at the top to go pull the RFC reference element from the citation library. And there's one for an internet draft. Comments in XML start with the less-than sign and the exclamation point. So this was created from a template. I can tell because it has all these comments in it that are instructive. This is the opening that we looked at earlier. So you're telling it what category you want. As long as you're creating an internet draft, then in the output, it automatically puts intended status and whatever you've set as the category. Doc name, that's the draft string, right? The file name that you're going to upload it to the internet draft repository with, and that shows up in the output underneath the title. And this is the IPR attribute that I mentioned earlier with the common one. Title actually comes later, and then it's kind of out of order. All the author elements are inside of the front. So in your XML file, you put all the author elements, but then in your output, that information, all of that information is not going to show up until the end of the document, and it automatically creates this author's addresses section, formats it in this way. And going down to, I was going to show you, they left the date element empty here for the document itself, and so what the converter does, it just inserts the current date and automatically calculates the expiration and includes that in the header as well. So here you see where they put an xref in a paragraph, and then in text that would just show up with square brackets. Here's where they've put a figure in. They used CData because there's a less than sign to make their arrow. Rather than replacing it with the entity, they just use CData. There's also this attribute of figure in our work is a line so that you can tell it you want them to be centered. So here's what it looked like in the text output. Another one where they've used CData doesn't actually contain any characters that would cause a problem, but they're just throwing the CData in, which is fine. And this is how you do nested sections, right? Like let's say you want to have section 4 and then section 4.1. You're going to nest section elements inside of each other. So here they open section 4 and then they open section 4.1 directly, and then they would close section 4.1 and open another one if they're doing 4.2, which they did in this case. So one common thing, so here's an example where they have, well, it's pseudocode in here, so they've just put it in as artwork, figure artwork, and then there's pseudocode. So one other thing I wanted to look at is the references. So here's where they put their change log. You can just make a section and use T tags for items. So there are a lot of instructions in this template about the references, but here's what their references section actually looks like in the XML file. They just call all the entities that they had defined at the top of the document. And the actual structure of this section is, I'm just gonna removing the comments so that it's easier to look at. So here they open the back section, they open a references element and label it normative references, put all the things, close references, open, close, right? So actually each of those entities, that when they pull that, it's going to be a single reference element. So the reference, this is a question that we get, is like, how do I make normative references and informative references? And you do it like this. Basically the references with S is equivalent to section. Without an S, it's making each of the individual items. Okay. I also was going to demo the ID creation wizard, or just show you what it looks like briefly. So you can see there are a lot of options here, right? Like if you wanted to get the HTML output of this, the same document, it's going to output it in this specific way. It always looks like this, more or less. And the beauty of this is you can jump to a certain section, and if you click the references, it jumps you down to the bottom. And if you click on this title, it takes you to the document, to the RFC itself, or internet draft in this case. Okay, the link to here's some more information too about that IPR attribute. This is on the main XML page. And this is the point that I was just going over about how you make the normative references and informative references section. The reason that this is important, making this distinction between normative and informative, is that a normative reference is one that's essential to understanding or implementing your document. And this distinction becomes even more important if your document is approved for publication as an RFC. Then we are looking closely at the normative references to make sure they've all been published, so the normative references aren't to a work in progress like an internet draft. And as some of you know, this leads to concurrent processing through the RFC editor queue, so that documents move forward through the process together if they are normatively linked, if they're essential to each other. Okay, scrolling down. So there's some useful links on here that we've talked about, the templates and the submission tool. I thought the wizard was on here, but it's not. All right. So this is what the wizard looks like. Let's see if I can make this guy a little smaller. So it's giving you some basic instructions at the beginning. It's telling you some things are optional, some things are required. I say, yes, create a new internet draft. Sorry. And, okay, I won't try to mess with the box anymore. If you see at the bottom, it has, the output so far looks like this, and this is the XML file. So you basically fill out this form, you know, a very important protocol, and you pick your IPR statement, pick your category, and you might want to pick other things too here. These are, the dotted ones are optional. And click next, and then I want to scroll down and look and see what it did. Oh, nice, it made this RFC line for me, it made, you know, it fills various things in for you. And now it's going to make my author information for me, so you can fill these in, and it moves you through the process. Okay, so it's creating things for me. So it's created the author block for me with what, you know, anyway, you fill out the form and makes the things, but now it's actually going to do the references for you. And you list RFC numbers, you list draft names, and it does it for you. So it asks you, do you want to use symbolic references or numeric references? How deep do you want the table of contents? So these are the ones that relate to the processing instructions that I mentioned. You can have them be sorted alphabetically. You're in the references section. And then the last two are about compact and subcompact. So this is basically like walking you through and then making the XML file below, which is pretty nice. And you can see the way that it's creating the, 2119 was automatically in there. It's doing it the long way, quote unquote. It's using the entities that are defined at the top of the document. Congratulations! So I already finished making my internet draft, but of course I haven't actually focused on the content or the body of the internet draft at that point. So you've basically made your own template. You've personalized your template, right? At that point you would still have to go in and put in all your content, and it's not going to automatically, magically put figure tags around your figures or list element around your lists. I was going to show Julian's HTML, but I think I'm just going to go back to the slides to make sure we do that and save that for the end, that one. Okay, links to RFC. So this is a screenshot, Lookma, no XML. if you already use Licks, this tool seems like it would be a great option. If you don't already use Licks and you don't want to deal with the raw XML, this might be an option you want to consider. Several things that are pointed out there. The why behind it, it's a WYSIWYG editor that's available on various platforms, used in academia, free, stable, and easy to use. That's not from my personal experience, this is via Yaron. And a complete internet draft can be written with no XML. It has a lot of the good things that we've talked about, things that make your life easier. It makes HTML, plain text, XML, and there's a user's guide and a sample draft as well. This is what the online conversion looks like. So similarly, you just tell it which file and convert, and then it spits out an HTML file or whatever you've selected. For submitting an internet draft, you would do text and possibly XML as well. Any questions about this one? Does anyone here already use Licks as an editor? Okay. This is basically a plug for tools in general, not just specific to internet drafts. So there are lots of useful links on tools.ietf.org. Here's some highlights. Here are some highlights. As mentioned, the ones for preparing documents. Searching and viewing documents, if you have already looked at the HTML-ized versions of internet drafts and RFCs, this is where they live. There is a way to, IETF doc fetch is a search bar for Firefox. I'll show you what it looks like actually after this slide. It has the diff tool options, so it lets you create that side-by-side diff that I showed earlier, or inline diff, or you can change the colors on the diff or the size of the font, various options. It has the daily dose of the IETF and the working group wikis. You might be familiar with many of these things. Also, if you want an RSS feed of every RFC that's published, you can sign up for that. Find that on there. And for IETF meetings, there are a lot of tools that are specific. There are actually even apps. You might be aware there's iPhone app and Android apps available for having the IETF agenda. The tarballs of working group drafts, so if you know you're going to a specific working group meeting this week, you can actually pull down a tarball that's all the drafts that are on their agenda. There are also checkers for formal languages. The ABNF parser and the review tools are available. So as I mentioned in the beginning, thanks go to the creators of the tools and the people who developed material for this tutorial. They include these people. Specifically, this tutorial came out of Elwyn Davies' slides that were for XML to RFC from several years ago, and also Stefan Sanderson made NROF edit, so he helped develop the material about NROF edit. If you have questions about the tools that we talked about today, the document preparation, you're trying to use NROF edit, it's not working, you're trying to use Licks to RFC, it's not working, obviously you have the option of contacting the developer directly, which is pretty clear from their documentation, but you also have the option of sending mail to Tools Discuss, because these people, the tool creators, are on Tools Discuss, or if they're not, then someone will contact them. XML to RFC mailing list is good for questions that are as simple as my file gives me this error, or I can't get it to make a bulleted list, or whatever, there's no question too small for the XML to RFC list. Also, the RFC editor can answer your questions about RFC editor process, or I'm happy to put give you more information about the tools we talked about today. And as mentioned, the RFC editor will be at a desk near the registration area Monday through Thursday. Any questions? Anything that you wish were part of this tutorial but it wasn't? Okay, reverse, anything you think should be, yes?
One quick question. When I One quick question. When I download an RFC from the web page and I then try to read it or import it into Microsoft Word, I mean, I'm on the European side, so I'm trying it with A4 format, and it doesn't work really. The pages are really wrapping around where they shouldn't be. I tried it with American Legal, and it doesn't work either. Or what the other American format that you can use, Legal and something else. But neither of these formats really work when I try to import an RFC document into Microsoft Word. Anything I'm doing wrong?
Specifically, printing a hard copy is your question, right? Mm-hmm. Printing a hard copy of an RFC. Yeah, there are two good options. One is using the tools.itf.org RFC, because there's a CSS for that HTML that prints it nicely. The page breaks are where the page breaks were supposed to be. There's also PDFs available of all the RFCs. So they're just plain text PDFs, like they don't contain any linking or any table of contents, but they would have the page breaks in the right place. Okay, I just remembered I was gonna show docfetch, but I'm gonna ask the reverse question. So I asked, was there something you wish that had been covered? So now the reverse question, is there something you wish be dropped out of this tutorial that's unnecessary content for this tutorial? Okay. You're welcome to, send mail. I'm going to show one more thing. The doc fetch toolbar, or search bar rather. I can't widen my, here we go. Here it is. Okay. So if you say you want to see all the documents that are about, let's say, the thing we looked at before was, I think we had a MENA document. You can do this. Docfetch is automatically going to search on the tools.itf.org server. So it's searching, it's thinking hard because there are probably a lot of MENA documents. And then it comes back with every draft that has MENA in the draft string. Similarly, so it even gets to the ones that are actually IETF MENA down here. So it's basically the same as if you had gone to the tools page and you had done search, but you're just searching in your search bar. It also takes RFC numbers, and it takes you right to this is the one that I was recommending for printing. tools.itf.org/html/RFC and the number. So this is the print preview for it. That's a little high. I mean, the footer's a little high, but the page breaks are actually where they were intended. And these are the diff links that I mentioned earlier. This is going to show you between the last version of the Internet Draft and the RFC, but if you were on an Internet Draft, then it would show you between two subsequent versions. And this is links to RFC. As you scroll down, you get the user's guide that has more detail and about installing the tool locally. I saved your sample file, I think. So let's see if it... thinking. So it just did it from the .loix. And this HTML output looks the same as XML to RFC's HTML output because, as mentioned, Lixt RFC runs XML to RFC as the last step. Okay, that's it for today. Thank you.
Where is the tutorial?
The tutorial's on the, it'll be included as part of the IETF stuff, but right now the slides are on the RFC editor homepage. So rfc-editor.org, if you scroll down, tutorial tools for creating IDs,